Harold Henthorn looked like the kind of guy who should be harmless. A middle-aged, suburban, khakis and polo type of dude, the kind of man you'd expect to spend his weekends grilling hot dogs and watching football. But instead of being just another dad joke machine from Colorado, Harold was secretly running the most suspicious insurance fraud scheme in history, disguised as oopsie accidents that kept happening only to his wives. If you wrote this story as fiction, it would sound like a bad soap opera, but the fact that it actually happened makes it both horrifying and honestly, ridiculously unbelievable. Harold married his first wife, Sandra Lynn Henthorn, in the mid-1990s. To outsiders, they looked like a perfectly normal couple. But behind the scenes, Harold was the type of man who thought romance meant taking his wife on suspicious outings that seemed designed by a Looney Tunes villain. In 1995, the couple went on a drive out in the middle of nowhere. Somehow, and I do mean somehow, their car just so happened to have a tyre problem. Lynn, being a decent human, got out to help. And then, wouldn't you know it, the car fell on her. She was crushed underneath. People would later point out that Harold's story of how the car just happened to drop itself like a cartoon anvil didn't make much sense, but at the time, her death was ruled an accident. And what do you know? Harold just so happened to walk away with a fat life insurance payout. Because apparently in the 90s, if you said tragic accident with a straight face, nobody looked any closer. Fast forward a few years. Harold remarries, this time to a successful ophthalmologist named Tony. From the outside, again, they looked like a happy couple. Vacations, church outings, smiling family portraits. But Harold had learned one thing from his first wife's accident. Insurance policies were basically like scratch-off lottery tickets if you played your cards right. So he took out not one, not two, but multiple life insurance policies on Tony. The total added up to almost $4.7 million, because nothing screams loving husband like secretly turning your wife into a human lottery ticket. Now here's where Harold's creativity, if you can even call it that, comes into play. He starts orchestrating little accidents for Tony. Once they were out in the mountains when a massive beam just happened to fall from their cabin deck and almost crushed her. Totally an accident, of course, according to Harold. Then there was the time she mysteriously suffered injuries in a car accident while they were on a remote road. Again, unlucky, tragic, but definitely convenient for Harold. It's almost like the Grim Reaper had Harold on retainer, following his wife around with an Acme catalogue of cartoon death traps. Finally, in 2012, Harold decided it was time for the grand finale. It was their wedding anniversary, and what better way to celebrate than by taking Tony on a romantic hike in Rocky Mountain National Park. Harold insisted they go off the main trail to some remote, secluded area, because nothing says romance like isolation, danger, and no cell service. At some point during their hike, Tony tripped and fell off a 128-foot cliff to her death. Harold called 911, but his story was full of holes, and rescuers who arrived on the scene thought his behaviour was bizarre. For one, he wasn't even trying to get down to her. For another, he somehow had a map in his car with an X marked exactly where Tony died. You know, totally normal stuff a grieving husband would have. Investigators started putting the pieces together. Wife number 1 accidentally crushed by a car. Wife number 2 falls off a cliff. Both women just so happened to be heavily insured, and Harold just so happened to be the beneficiary. That's not bad luck. That's Harold running a murder franchise and disguising it as America's worst honeymoon package. His lies began to unravel. Phone records contradicted his story. His financial motive was crystal clear. And when prosecutors laid everything out, it looked less like a grieving husband's tragedy and more like Harold had been auditioning for the role of Wile E. Coyote, except instead of trying to kill a roadrunner, he just kept targeting his wives. In 2015, Harold Henthorn was convicted of a first-degree murder for Tony's death and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He never admitted guilt, never confessed, and to this day probably tells himself he's just unlucky. But unlucky is slipping on a banana peel. Unlucky is locking your keys in your car. Having 2 wives die under cartoonishly suspicious accidental circumstances, both times leaving you with life insurance payouts. That's not unlucky. That's a bad Lifetime movie written by an insurance salesman. And that's the story of Harold Henthorn, the man who turned marriage into a murder-for-money scheme, who looked like a church-going suburban dad, but actually belonged in a true crime hall of fame for sheer audacity. The fact that he thought he could keep pulling this off is almost as ridiculous as the fact that he got away with it once. In the end, his suburban dad disguise didn't save him. Instead of grilling hot dogs in his backyard, he's now serving life in prison, the only insurance policy he can't cash out.